Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jessica Freiberg, Managing Partner of Soceti, and I want to welcome all of you to today's webinar. Debbie Rabishaw, who leads our HR Advisory Services area here at Soceti, will be sharing the hidden HR risks in growing companies. Feel free to put any questions in the chat throughout her presentation, and we will be sure to get to those at the end of the session. Now I'm going to turn it over to Debbie.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Debbie Rabishaw, and I'm pleased to have you here today. I have about 35 plus years of experience in small and mid-sized businesses, running their HR, and I have worked in a variety of industries. So hopefully what you'll hear today is representative of the organization that you are in. And what you've seen. I will give you a warning in advance that this is not to make you feel bad if you're like, oh no, I've seen all of these things before, but this is really about learning about the patterns and things that might be hidden in your organization that are starting to emerge and ways that you can address that. So let's get started. So this session is not going to be about compliance checklists or legal requirements, although we are going to talk a little bit about some of the laws. It's really about how organizations actually operate once they have a small team. By the time a company has multiple employees, systems already exist in your organization, and they really just aren't written down yet. You will start to see communication habits emerge, how people share information and raise their issues. You'll see decision patterns, who's making the decisions and how do those decisions actually get made. And you'll start to see behavioral patterns emerge. What behavior gets corrected and what quietly becomes acceptable. So those patterns form long before a formal HR structure exists or you acknowledge that you need one. I often hear leaders say, we don't really have HR yet. But when I look at how their team operates, the systems are already there. They're just informal. They exist from day one. You just may not know that it's there. So one of the biggest misconceptions I see is that HR systems start when a company decides to put HR in place. In reality, by the time you have multiple employees, you already have the systems, as we talked about. They just may not be written down yet. So you have those communication habits, you have the decision patterns, you have the behavioral patterns. All of those together form your operating system as an organization. And early on, those systems usually feel efficient enough. They're fast, they're flexible, they're based on trust and proximity. But when I first start working with an organization, I'm not creating systems from scratch in every case. I'm usually identifying the ones that already exist and helping leaders see them more clearly and where there's opportunity for growth. As organizations grow, those informal systems we talked about don't break all at once. They usually start to show strain in very specific ways, and it usually shows up in three different categories. First, you have the inconsistencies. Similar situations are handled differently across the organizations, and I'm confident that you all know what I'm talking about. One manager addresses performance directly, another avoids it. It's really about your tolerance and appetite for difficult conversations. Two employees in similar roles receive different expectations because of how their managers communicate and understand the business. And over time, those differences become visible. The second is confusion. Employees and managers aren't always clear on expectations or how decisions are made. When there isn't a shared definition of good work, people interpret feedback as opinion, not as a measuring stick against what those standards are. And the third is avoidable risk. This is where leaders don't always realize what they don't know. So decisions are made without full awareness of obligations or implications. For example, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, how do you decide if an employee is exempt or non-exempt? So at this stage, it just doesn't feel like risk yet. It just feels like things are getting harder to manage. And together, these three things, the inconsistency, the confusion, and the risk, they're usually the earliest signs that informal systems are starting to break down. Before anything feels like a major HR issue, leaders usually start to notice red flags. And those are the signals that something underneath the surface isn't fully defined yet. The feedback feels personal, which we mentioned, and when expectations aren't clearly established, feedback can come across as opinion. So instead of hearing, here's what needs to improve, employees hear, this is about me, which can create defensiveness or disengagement. I have been in those situations many times, trying to diffuse those conversations that managers have had. Second are the expectations that vary by manager. Different managers handle similar situations in different ways, and we just kind of discussed that. One manager may be very direct about performance, while another avoids the conversation. Over time, the employees begin to notice those differences, and it can create questions about fairness and consistency. And the third thing that you may be experiencing early on is that small issues take too long to resolve. Things that should be quick conversations or decisions, they drag out because leaders spend time figuring out what should happen instead of acting because there isn't a shared approach guiding those decisions. These aren't major problems on their own, but together they're usually the first indication that the organization has outgrown informal ways of managing people. And so when I talk to leadership teams, they rarely describe big HR problems first. Usually you're talking to me about the symptoms. What am I seeing? How's it showing up in everyday work? So they don't know how to have difficult performance conversations. They were trying to let employees make decisions, but no expectations of outcomes were established. So now the coworkers are starting to resent other coworkers and office culture is interrupted, and it gets messy. HR is messy. So when organizations begin to feel that strain that we just talked about, the inconsistency, the confusion, the length of resolution, it usually ties back to a few core areas. And generally, these are the foundations that matter early on. Each one connects directly to something leaders are already experiencing. So today we're going to dive a little bit deeper into onboarding and role clarity. If people don't understand their role from the beginning, confusion starts early. We're going to talk about performance expectations. Without a shared definition of good work, feedback becomes inconsistent. And in basic compliance awareness, leaders are already making decisions that have compliance implications, whether they realize it or not, or whether they are informed or not about the rules that they need to use to make those compliance decisions. And then culture. How behavior is addressed or ignored starts shaping the organization early and quickly. Pay consistency is also really important, and it's an important foundation to consider early on. Compensation decisions begin early in somebody's tenure, and they are remembered. These 5 areas sit underneath most of the issues we just talked about, and quite simply, if they're informal, things start to feel harder. If they're structured, things start to feel easier. Think about playing a game without a set of rules or frameworks. You just are given the pieces and the game board, and you have to figure out what the end game looks like, what it looks like to win. So what I want to do next is walk through each of these 5 foundations briefly and talk a little bit about what good looks like in practice. So the first thing we want to talk about is onboarding. And onboarding is often treated as paperwork, but in reality, it's one of the first operating processes a new employee experiences. And I always think of onboarding as starting during their first conversation that they have with you as an employer. So before they're even an employee, they're a candidate. And you are constantly onboarding even after they've been hired and even into their first 6 months. You are always onboarding new employees. Onboarding should create clarity and momentum. If it's done well, the employee, it gives the employee three things right away. First of all, it gives them role clarity. What did you hire me to do? What am I here to do? They understand what they're responsible for and how their role fits into the organization and what success looks like. Critical. I mean, you can't ask for more than being able to provide that to an employee. That's an expensive mistake if you don't get that right. Excuse me. And the second is employee experience. This is their first real impression of how the organization operates. So from that candidate experience all the way through their first year, are things organized? Do people communicate clearly? They're doing that comparison test between where they came from and where they are. Do they feel welcome and set up to succeed? That experience will shape how quickly they engage and how confident they feel in their role. And the third thing is early expectations. What should they be focused on in the first few weeks? What does success look like in the first 30 days? I guarantee you, if you don't know, they don't know. And they need to understand that in order to be a productive employee sooner than later. When those expectations are clear, employees will ramp up faster. Managers will have a shared reference point for feedback. And when those three things are missing, confusion shows up quickly and performance issues will follow pretty quickly. I often see organizations bring on strong hires, but without clear onboarding structure. Those employees spend the first weeks trying to figure out the priorities instead of contributing. You may say, figure out who the leaders are and give them a call and set up your appointments. And that's great, but realize that is valuable time in terms of carving out of their learning curve to be able to grease the wheels for them. So once role clarity and early expectations are defined, performance typically will improve quickly. So let's talk about performance. Because once you've created role clarity and job descriptions, and by the way, don't underestimate a good job description. That should happen when you are actually, before they're even hired, you should be taking a look and developing those job descriptions so you know what you're hiring for. You can then focus on aligning those jobs to job performance and taking a look at key performance indicators in the process. So performance becomes difficult when organizations don't share a clear definition of success with their employees. Take the time to establish what good work means. Employees need to understand expectations in terms of outcomes. How do their responsibilities map to what success looks like? Look at how feedback is given and, quite frankly, received by some of your managers. Managers need a consistent way to discuss performance, and employees need a good way to be able to give that feedback upwards. And be clear about what happens when expectations aren't met. Improvement conversations should follow a predictable structure and should not be scary. It should be ongoing. So when these elements are clear, performance conversations become much easier. All right, let's talk about compliance. We said this wasn't going to be a compliance webinar, and quite frankly, we're not going to be talking about how you do things, but compliance is happening whether it's structured or not in your organizations. If even absence of compliance is how you're meeting the definition of compliance. So let's talk about what compliance is. It often feels like a separate HR function, but in reality, it's embedded in everyday decisions that leaders are already making. And when expectations aren't clearly defined in these areas, feedback and the decisions can feel personal rather than grounded in something objective. So I think maybe you're getting the trend I'm setting here, which is if you don't have something written down, all of this feels personal to the employee. They need to be able to understand what the rules of the game are, what's fair, and this is what helps establish that for you. There are a few core areas where I see this show up often. The first is job classification, as I mentioned earlier. And this includes decisions around, is somebody exempt? Are they non-exempt? Are they a contractor versus an employee? And when we talk about exempt versus non-exempt, really what we're saying is, are they overtime eligible or are they not? That is not a preference. That is actually grounded in labor law. And there are decisions around how you make the determination if somebody is an employee, or if they're a contractor, or if they receive overtime. And when you make decisions that impact how people are paid or how overtime is handled, it's very sensitive for an employee. So many organizations make those decisions early without realizing the long-term implications because they're just looking at what's in front of them, or understanding if there are rules that they should be considering or laws that are on the books that they need to keep in mind. The second are handbooks, my favorite topic. A handbook should reflect how the organization actually operates. If there isn't one in place or it hasn't been reviewed in years, leaders and employees are often working from different assumptions about policies and expectations. How has your work environment morphed? What have you informally put in place that are practices rather than policies? And are you treating them like policies? And they may not be aligned with the law. The third is documentation. This includes offer letters, policy acknowledgments, and written records of key conversations. I have had clients who do not have offer letters. They will verbally extend an offer and go from there. And I know you all know better than to do that. If you have a handbook, are you making sure that they've acknowledged that they have received the handbook? And are you keeping written records of those key conversations that you have around performance? Without documentation, it becomes difficult to show that expectations were communicated consistently. I often say if you don't have documentation, it didn't happen. And my guess is if you've consulted with your employment attorney, they have probably said that too. You need to have something in writing or be able to demonstrate in writing some sort of thread of conversation. The fourth thing that I see is how people handle their I-9s. And if you'll recall, I-9s are something that every organization, doesn't matter what industry or what size, need to make sure they have completed within 3 days of an employee's start date. It is how people identify that they are eligible to work in the United States. And this is one of the most basic compliance requirements, but it's also one of the most commonly missed or mishandled areas. Forms may not be completed on time. As I mentioned, there's a 3-day deadline. They may be incomplete and not filled out, or they may not even be stored correctly. I bet you didn't know that you have to store them separately for your employees. They can't be in their employee folders. So none of these issues usually start as intentional. They may happen because the organization is moving quickly, or you're focused on growth, or you're just happy to get the people through the door and you want to move forward. But these are things to consider. They're landmines. So let's talk a little bit about culture, which is reinforced through everyday actions. You've probably heard the phrase, culture eats strategy for lunch. Well, what that really means is that even the best plans that you have that are in writing don't work if people don't operate consistently day to day. So people will talk about culture as something big and complex, and quite frankly, it sounds a little scary to figure out how you're going to shape your culture, not just through parties or small employee celebrations. In reality, you see it in how people conduct themselves every day. The workplace culture develops through everyday behavior, not just values that you end up putting on a wall. And there are 3 areas where culture shows up clearly. The first is in respect. Employees need to understand what professional behavior looks like in your organization, and quite frankly, the respect that you offer employees in return. How do your people communicate? How are disagreements handled, and what's acceptable in your work environment and what isn't? And it's okay to articulate that. The second is behavioral expectations. Leaders need to be consistent in how they respond to employee behavior. So if one manager addresses an issue and another ignores it, you can bet that employees are going to quickly learn that expectations are flexible. They are not set in stone. And over time, that inconsistency is what becomes your culture. Third, the employees need a safe way to raise concerns. They need to feel psychological safety in the workplace. They need to feel they can speak up without worrying about negative consequences. If they don't feel safe raising concerns or the issues don't disappear, they just go underground, and that is really where your risk increases. So at the end of the day, culture isn't what's written in a handbook. It's what leaders consistently reinforce through their actions. And in leadership work, I spend a lot of time helping managers understand that every response, whether they address something or ignore it or let it go, is shaping culture in real time. Oh, our favorite topic, pay and trust. Compensation is one of the earliest areas where employees start forming opinions about fairness and about trust with their employer. Pay decisions shape trust early and last longer than you would expect. And the key thing to remember is that early pay decisions tend to stick much longer than leaders expect. Even when those decisions were made quickly or informally at the time, employees remember them. So here are the three things that I think matter most here. The first is equity perception. Employees don't just look at their own pay. They pay attention to how decisions are made across the organization. They're asking themselves, is this fair? Does this make sense compared to others? I often say to myself, think about how I would feel. And I ask myself those questions, and that gives me a lot of insight. The second is consistency. Consistency matters. Leaders need a consistent approach to how compensation decisions are made. Without that, two similar roles can end up with very different pay simply based on timing or negotiation, or even the manager's comfort with looking at what's happening in the market. And over time, those inconsistencies become visible. The third important thing to consider is pay clarity and decision rationale. Employees don't necessarily expect every decision to be identical, but they do expect it to be explainable. They like clarity, and when leaders can clearly articulate why someone is paid a certain way, based on their role or experience or scope, it builds trust. So when that rationale isn't clear, people fill in the gaps themselves, and that's where frustration tends to build because the story is never positive. They never say, I'm overpaid. Wow, I've got to get other people to work here. That's just not the story that they create in their head. And at the end of the day, this isn't just about compensation. It's about your credibility and your organization's credibility. So I'll often see organizations revisit compensation decisions once they grow and realize that the early hires that they made and new hires are being paid differently for similar work. In those situations, the issue usually isn't intent. It's that decisions were made at different times without a consistent framework. Once a structure and clear rationale are in place, those conversations become much easier for leaders to manage. And I think we're getting some questions in the chat. What I'll do is I'll walk through this because I may answer some of your questions, and that's what stopped me in the middle of my slide here. And then what we'll do is we'll answer your questions and we'll get those addressed for you. So let's talk about where leaders are creating the risk. By the time the organizations reach this point, they're already feeling some strain, so the feedback they're giving isn't landing well. Managers are handling things differently. The small issues, as we mentioned, are taking long. So leaders try to fix it quickly, and that's where the accidental risk shows up. A very common example of this risk where people are trying to fix problems quickly and expediently and cheaply is what I call the borrowed handbook problem. And organizations download a template or they reuse a handbook from another company just to have something in place and mitigate their risk because now they have a handbook. And the issue is that those policies reflect someone else's workplace and someone else's compliance requirements. Sometimes I've seen it where they even forget to change the name of the organization. Sometimes the handbook references policies the company doesn't actually follow. Or other times it hasn't been updated as the company has grown or expanded into new states. So if you've grown over state lines, it's really time to take a look. If you haven't updated your handbook in 2 years, it's time to take a look. There are also operational gaps that happen at the same time. For example, we talked about I-9s not being completed correctly or on time. That is risky. Performance conversations happening but not documented. Managers addressing issues informally with no record of the conversation. None of this is intentional. It usually happens because, first of all, managers don't know better, but they have good intention, or because the business is moving quickly and assumes that these details will get handled when they get bigger. They need to be handled now. I'll often see organizations that had multiple conversations about performance, but nothing was ever documented. And so when a situation escalates, there's no record showing expectations were clearly communicated. It's risky because now you've lost time in trying to formally address this with an employee. If the employee becomes disgruntled, you have no record of how you tried to course correct any performance issues. So again, these are the risks that I'm pointing out, but I understand they happen accidentally, but you're not in a position to not fix it at this point. So risk stays invisible until something forces a closer look. And most of those gaps don't show up right away. They usually stay under the surface until something creates pressure. And that's usually when somebody terminates, you have an employee complaint, there's a leave issue or regulatory audit, somebody comes knocking on your door from a government agency, or there's a disgruntled employee who's raising concerns and talking amongst your employee population. So that is when you are most at risk, because then your non-policies start bubbling up to the top. So when that happens, the organization suddenly needs to provide documentation. They need to think about the consistency in how they're addressing employee issues, and they need clear policies. And if those weren't built earlier, leaders are forced to reconstruct decisions under pressure. There's also a real time and financial cost at that point. Leaders may spend days gathering records. I know I've done it myself, reviewing files and responding to inquiries. So even if the organization ultimately did nothing wrong, the process itself takes time and attention away from running your business. And in some cases, there are also direct financial implications, which I'm sure you're aware of, potential penalties from audits, the legal costs to fix it after the fact, and then settlements that could have been avoided with stronger documentation. So I've seen organizations spend significant time recreating performance histories because conversations weren't documented. Another example is preparing for an I-9 audit, needing to review every employee file to identify gaps, only to discover that you never got documentation to begin with. And that's really where the earlier avoidable risk becomes very real. And so this is exactly why building structure earlier matters. Not to create bureaucracy, not to have more red tape and approvals and decision makers, but really to avoid having to create everything later under pressure. It's very stressful. So having strong foundations is the solution to everything we just talked about, not, again, to create a bureaucracy, not as overhead, but as a way to remove the friction we just talked through. Strong foundations will reduce inconsistency. So instead of each manager handling things differently, there's a shared approach, and you can align it to your value system. They remove strong foundations remove confusion. Employees understand expectations, and managers know how to respond, and they prevent avoidable risk because decisions are documented, they're consistent, and they're grounded in something clear. And that's what makes your leadership so much easier. Leaders won't be reacting in the moment or trying to recreate decisions after the fact. They have a framework they can rely on. And once that framework is in place, a lot of what felt complicated becomes much more manageable. So what does this mean for you? Well, if some of this felt familiar, it doesn't mean something has gone wrong. Most organizations reach this exact point as they grow, and you're not behind and you're not alone. what you're experiencing is a natural shift from informal to more structured people practices. And the important part is these are very solvable problems. You don't need a large HR department to address them. What you need is clarity. You need clear expectations, you need clear processes, you need clear decision-making frameworks. So once those are in place, many of these issues resolve more quickly and leadership becomes much easier. And you can work on the activities that will move the business forward, not just on the reactive activities of managing your people. Most of the work I do with organizations at this stage is helping them take what already exists informally and turning it into something consistent, repeatable, and meaningful for their business and their employees. So this is when we're going to get a chance to pause and open it up for questions just before we get started, so I don't forget. If you're interested in exploring HR solutions for your organization, please feel free to reach out to your Sassetti contact directly or to reach out to us at an email that will be shared momentarily. And they'll put us in touch. So we are going to, I think we're going to break this fourth wall, as my friend Tyler says, and we're going to have Jessica take a look at what questions popped in and how we can answer them for you.
Great. Yeah, we have a few questions. So the first one is really kind of goes back to the employee performance side. Do you have a suggestion or do you recommend, like a formal employee review process annually, or, kind of what's the recommendation? I'm sure some people out there are doing informal, but what do you recommend as far from to make sure that they're covered?
Yeah, the first thing I would recommend is do what works for your organization, but not doing something is not an option. There is a lot of debate about, is the annual review really the best way to do it? I don't think so. And the reason I don't think having one review every year is because you've now lost a year of feedback you could have been giving to somebody to course correct over the course of that year. And in today's time, that's like 7 dog years, 1 year. It's ridiculous. And so I would suggest you figure out what works best for your organization. Is it a quarterly conversation with the hiring manager or the manager that is responsible for the outcomes? Is it a self-review? Is it a peer review? Do you have one formal kind of a collective review at one point in the year, and just those conversations to be able to make sure that your work is moving along swiftly? So I don't think there's any one right way to do it. I would be true to what your organization can handle.
Great, thank you. Another question, I think with some of our clients here at Sassetti, we've seen this as a little bit of a challenge over the last year or two, or something that's maybe being questioned a little bit more by the Department of Labor, and that's around the distinction between a W-2 employee versus a 1099. Mm-hmm. Is that something that you've seen be questioned more recently, or anything that you could give thoughts on?
Well, I think those laws are going to change again shortly, and so we're always keeping up. I see this a lot. I have people that have been contractors when I come into an organization for a long time. And generally, the most important thing to remember, and it's different in California too, if you have locations in California, but the most important thing to remember is that if you are the only source of income for that person, then they probably are not a contractor. Now, I am not an attorney, and I don't play one on TV. But I do know how to evaluate whether or not that person is a contractor. And so these laws under different administrations change. And so we should be aware that it is likely going to revert back to some older practices soon, although I don't have the specifics for the purpose of this conversation.
But if there's questions on that, feel free to follow up with Debbie directly.
Please,
we put her email in the chat.
I like to talk about specifics. So
yeah. The last question we have right now, but again, feel free to put any other questions that you have in the chat so we can follow up, is kind of just around the pay transparency. I think this is, becoming, again, a more prevalent conversation. how far do we go from a pay transparency perspective? And do you think kind of as long as you have things buttoned up behind the scenes and the thing, you mentioned pay clarity, that things are clear and that, what's happening behind the scenes is fair and equitable. Do you think there's a further step, companies or organizations need to take with pay transparency, or you think that, I don't know, where are you?
Mm-hmm. What are my thoughts?
Yeah.
So pay transparency and pay clarity. And I think that they are two different things. Pay clarity to me is what's the decision-making mechanism behind how people are getting paid. Like, do we pay to the middle of our grade? Do we pay at the top of our grade because we're in a very competitive industry? But people need to understand that. And when I grew up, right, I mean, just personal conversations about money, you didn't talk about money. And so to talk about it on a more open platform that demands that you talk about money can be very difficult depending upon where you are in your career. Gen Y and Z, they don't have any problems talking about it. Millennials have more problems talking about it. So I think there's the conversation around it and how comfortable are you with it? What can you do to meet the law but not feel like you're exposing everything from a competitive advantage? And I think one of the things you can do, especially when you post jobs, is to make sure that you're indicating the right pay range so that you are getting the right people to apply. And just know that everybody expects they're going to be paid at the top of the range, whatever you post, because they feel that they deserve it. I have never seen somebody to say, you know what, I'm going to do this because I am at the bottom of that range, and that's what I am looking for. So it is something that we have to get comfortable with because it is increasing. It's designed to make sure that there is equity in pay, that there is not a different pay for a different gender. And I think I addressed all of your questions. Did I miss any part?
Nope, that was great.
Okay, great. Anything else?
That's all we have.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time today. And I believe the address that you can email me at has been popped into the chat. And we appreciate you taking the time to sit with Sassetti today and discuss HR. Thank you so much.